We would like to dedicate this session and subsequent sessions to Mr. Kishor Chetty, who passed away over a week ago. He was a great friend of literature and writing in Fiji. Writers and artists, they need friends like Kishor Chetty who take interest in your work and appreciate what you do. Writers, artists, musicians, filmmakers in Fiji, they're always creating the work in the hope that somebody will appreciate. You do not know who will appreciate. And when you have somebody like Kishor Chetty around, you know there is one person who will appreciate what you're doing. Kishor used to come to literary gatherings. He used to come to readings by writers. He used to come to book launches, and he bought books for himself and for friends. And that was the great thing about Kishor, and he'll be very sadly missed. I said in the last session that I will now begin to talk about the creative process, the more practical side of writing. And in order to demonstrate how a writer proceeds with his work, I said I will select a story of mine and show you how it began from a seed of an idea and developed into a full story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I decided to choose a story of my own because I know a lot about how it got created. I can talk about the story from the inside. I always enjoyed when writers talked about how they created a particular work. Not only writers, but I'm also interested in filmmakers who tell me how they got an idea and how they developed the idea and created a whole out of the idea. Now, the story that I said that I will talk about is Gamalien's Women. The story was first published in a volume called The Fantasy Eaters. I'm afraid The Fantasy Eaters is out of print at the moment, and we are hoping that a second edition will come out early next year, so that Gamalien's Women will become available again. I will choose about that. I've chosen that story because it's a story that I enjoyed very much writing. Now, if a story gives you that kind of pleasure, it becomes painless in writing. Having said that, I will also explain that it took me a long time to be able to finish that story. I will begin with that notion of a seed again. I introduced that notion last time. I said just like in nature, everything begins with a seed and then develops into a plant that bears fruit. Writing is very much like that. You begin with the seed of an idea, and then you give it a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, the seed for Gamalien's Women came to me when I was doing some research in the 1970s in Vanuatu on indenture system. There, someone casually told me a story about an old woman who died one morning, and in the afternoon she was taken to be buried. But before they were able to put her in the grave, she got up, she rose from the dead, as it were, and demanded that she be taken home. I thought that maybe something can be done with that story. I did not proceed to write that story. I treated it as like an anecdote which would go into my notebook. Now here I must encourage writers to keep a notebook. Writers and filmmakers and even musicians will gain a lot by keeping a notebook in which they jot down ideas that come to them, and then as the ideas develop, put down more notes on the particular idea. And that's what I did with Gamalien's Woman. I stored the idea in the corner of my memory, and then later I put it down in a notebook, and said to myself that later on, when I have finished what I'm doing, maybe I'll turn to that and see if I can develop a story around that idea. I finished the project that I was working on. I finished the short story that I was writing, and then I turned to my notebook for ideas for the next project. And that's when I realized I had an interesting seed there in the story of this woman who died one morning and rose in the afternoon. I began to think about it. I began to see the possibilities in it. And gradually the seed began to germinate. I got a little frustrated because it was a very difficult idea. What could one do with a woman who died and then got up? It was a bit like the Lazarus story in the Bible. I went back to something else and left that story for some years because I could not proceed very far with that. Then when I went back to it, things began to happen. I was told very vaguely that the woman's name was Kameli. An interesting name, but I couldn't do very much with Kameli. Gradually the name began to be transformed in my imagination. Kameli gradually became Gamalien, and that triggered a lot of other things. The story's title came to me quite early. Usually it doesn't happen like that. Usually title come much later. But the title Gamalien's Woman came to me as I began to think about that story and the possibility of creating a full fiction around this particular woman. Now, when I decided that the woman will be called Gamalien, other things begin to happen. The finding of a name is very important for me, and I spend a lot of time finding the right name for characters in my story. And I would like to suggest to you that you should also think about the names you give your characters quite seriously, because sometimes part of your work is done if you find a suitable name for your character. The name should have some kind of resonance. It should somehow reinforce the subject that you are working on. Now, what did Gamalien contribute to the story? Well, first thing, it was an ambiguous name. And I liked the ambiguity because the story itself was ambiguous. It was ambiguous in the sense that somebody who dies and then in the afternoon taken to be buried and rises again is an ambiguous kind of story. It's almost like a fantasy. So this name itself suggested to me something which was uncertain, which was not very clear, it was ambiguous. And that was very good. I was committed to the idea of calling the story Gamalien's Woman. Now, once I have found the name, I have found the character, then I had to begin to give this character some kind of roundedness, to develop this character. Now, I will talk a lot about development of character because stories depend on interesting characters. If you find interesting characters for your story or for your film, you have your task there in front of you to evolve that character into some kind of roundedness. And the protagonist that you select for your story should have roundedness. How does the character acquire roundedness? A character acquires roundedness when you can physically see the character. We can visualize what the character looks like. When you understand the emotions of the character. When you know the psychology of a particular character. That's what contributes to roundedness and adds complexity to a particular character, in contrast to other characters who remain relatively flat. If a character is someone I can visualize only, remains a flat character. Now, I will proceed to talk about Gamalien's woman in the next session. I would like to conclude that this session again by remembering Kishor Chetty, who passed away a week ago, and we're dedicating this session and the subsequent session to his memory.